All right, so we're looking at the life and reign of King David. Not me, the other David, my namesake. We have been working our way through all the eras of the Old Testament, and right now we are in the period of the United Monarchy, which will be under the reigns of Saul, David, and David's son Solomon. In a couple weeks, we'll start shifting into the divided monarchy, the dark ages of the Old Testament that few ever know anything about, and that'll be deep stuff. So, as it looks right now, we're covering David today, next week Solomon and the building of the temple. The weekend after that, we will look at how the kingdom of Israel divides into Judah in the south and Israel in the north. And then we will take Super Bowl Sunday off because it's the Super Bowl. American holiday. And then we'll start up again on the 16th and start looking at the dynasties of the Northern Kingdom and their associated Southern Kingdom counterparts. All right. So David, his life is covered in the second half of 1 Samuel. The entirety of the book of 2 Samuel, and a very large portion of the book 1 Chronicles. And he also wrote a great number of the Psalms. There's a handout that I gave you a while back that shows all of those Psalms. Do you want to track that one down? He had no shortage of Psalms that he wrote, but he did not write nearly all of them.
85% of them.
Large number. There we go. So, in that particular handout, we'll see some of the other authors of the Psalms. Book 1 is primarily written by David, and there's just a few that are unknown. And the lion's share of Book 2 in the Psalms was also written by David. How the Psalms got broken up and divided into books, I actually do not know. But there's a couple other authors that start coming into play here. The sons of Korah are an interesting set of figures because those are the descendants of Korah who led Korah's rebellion. You remember in the law of Moses, sons were not supposed to be put to death for the sins of their fathers. And they ended up writing some of the scriptures, as it turns out.
Wait, so you're saying that not all of Korah's household died with him? So presumably he was an older man who had sons who were out of his household and had families of their own and chose not to attend with him.
Yes, because he was a cousin of Moses, and so that would probably put him up in the 80 to 90-year-old range. Maybe only 60 or 70, but yes, he would have likely had sons who were of age and could choose their own household's decisions. And so,
The elders were squabbling.
say what?
The elders were squabbling.
Yeah. Anyway, so one of David's musicians that he appointed was a guy by the name of Asaph, and those are the psalms that are highlighted in orange. So he wrote a large chunk of Book 3. Along with another guy by the name of Ethan the Ezrahite, which is probably a descendant of Ezra, who comes way later, but that's not known. Moses has a psalm. Psalm 90 was written by Moses. Solomon wrote a couple of the psalms, 72 and 127. And then there's a large number that are just simply not ascribed to any particular author. But David gets the lion's share of the psalms. I think probably amounts to 60 or 70 out of 150. So that portion of the scriptures were also in relation to David. All right, so looking back here, we have an outline of 1 Samuel. And as we saw last time, the first 8 chapters of Samuel are about the birth and life of Samuel. And then we have another 6 chapters or 7 chapters devoted to Saul and his reign, a lion's share of which is really not delved into in any detail. Saul is rejected as the king, though, and before Samuel has even passed away from this world, he anoints David as king, and that's what we hit in chapter 16. And you have David and Saul interacting from chapter 16 all the way through 31. And so we see the latter portion of Saul's reign while David is on the ascendancy and on the run quite extensively. But we don't see much of the early part of his reign other than a couple battles. So moving into this, David is the youngest of 8 sons of Jesse from Bethlehem, the great-grandson of Ruth and Boaz. Rahab is his great-great-grandmother. And that gives you an idea of how many generations came through the judges, that if they're stretched out to their oldest extremes.
I suppose because
Boaz was very likely an older man when Ruth married him. Anyway, so Samuel comes, anoints him king over Israel, but Saul is still on the throne, and they kind of just let God deal with that. But the Spirit of the Lord comes on David when he's anointed, and that's one of the reasons why we get this imagery in the Old Testament about the anointing oil as being consecrated or set apart by God for some purpose. The priest would be anointed, and prophets would be anointed, and the king was also anointed. And then Jesus was the anointed one, which is what Messiah means, and he was the prophet, the priest, and the king. So there's actually messianic overtures in this too, or overtones. At the time that the Spirit departs from Saul and comes upon David, Saul becomes tormented by an evil spirit, and David actually gets recruited to play music because he's such a fine musician. One of his Saul's soldiers and officers, noted David was a skilled musician, and David was ministering to Saul and preventing the evil spirit from tormenting him too badly. And then quite quickly after this, we have an interesting episode with the famous giant of the Bible, Goliath. He doesn't get nearly as many mentions as the other 3, Sheshai, Talmai, and Ahiman, the 3 giants of Hebron that Caleb drove out into the land of the Philistines. I have often thought that they were the ancestors of Goliath, most likely. Collaborating here with some secular history, the Philistines actually were a group of refugees from Crete that landed in that area, and they actually stole that region from the control of the Egyptians and displaced Egyptian power there sometime during the period of the Judges, probably about the time that they start showing up in the Judges as the oppressors of Israel, days of Samson and Jephthah. But there are still giants living amongst the Philistines, probably the descendants of the Rephites. So this one giant, Goliath, is defying the army of Israel, persists in taunting them for 40 days, challenging one of them to fight one-on-one with him, which was a fool's errand if you were going to fight with a sword or a spear, because the guy was enormous. And David, this little shepherd boy, decides he's going to go up and fight him without any armor and without a sword. Instead, he just takes a sling, which gives him a lethal killing range of several hundred feet, much further than Goliath was able to hurl a spear. Goliath really didn't stand a chance.
Dude, I've seen videos, like, depending on the sling, it could have been more than several hundred feet. Now, obviously, accuracy would decrease, but if you get a good-sized sling, you can hurl a rock.
Yep. They found some stones on battlefields that they think were sling stones, and they're like softball, cantaloupe-sized rocks. And they could hurl these things in excess of 100 miles an hour. So if you can imagine one of those hitting you between the eyes, like Goliath just didn't stand a chance. He was a goner. Yep.
He was the underdog.
He was the underdog in that fight, and he did not even know it. Yep. Anyhow, David takes him down, cuts his head off, gets his sword actually later, and Then he takes his head to Jerusalem, which is held by the Jebusites at that point in time, and he puts Jerusalem on notice. There is somebody in town.
He takes his head to Jerusalem and just shows it off.
Yep. Jerusalem of the Jebusites. But Israel begins singing the praises of David. They say, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Which is kind of funny, seeing as he's only taken out Goliath, but they're already attributing to him tens of thousands. It's possible that they were attributing all the men who were slain in the defeat that the Philistines suffered after that. But that provoked Saul's jealousy, and that becomes the theme of their relationship. So then this is really complicated for a long time, because Saul and David have this dependency on each other, and it makes for a really complicated, convoluted relationship. So obviously, since he's a hero, Saul makes him an officer in the army, and he becomes a very successful military leader for the Israelites, and he's successful in everything he's doing. And Saul is just simply hoping that he's going to go to battle and the Philistines will kill him someday in battle, and this fails over and over and over again. And he's still in the musical business, and so he's playing a lyre for Saul when he's tormented. That became a little more risky now that Saul's jealous of him, and he actually throws a spear at David trying to kill him. David was able to evade, and so then Saul tries a different approach. Let's try and entice him into a pitched battle with the Philistines. I'm going to offer him my daughter in marriage. But Saul is unsuccessful in offering his older daughter, Merab. But then David actually falls in love with Saul's younger daughter, Michal. And Saul heard about this, and he's like, now I can snare him. And so Saul demands that David bring him 100 Philistine foreskins as the bride price. And he's banking on David not surviving this mission. And David goes out and gets 200.
That's crazy.
The irony is just dripping here in this passage, though, because the Philistines were like those uncircumcised Philistines, and David goes and circumcises the Philistines to get a wife. And so this was something that would not fly under the Geneva Conventions today, but for the Israelites, it's like, just stick it to them. They're our enemies, and let's see what else we can do. Keep whooping on them, David. Because the Philistines have been oppressing the Israelites for several generations, and so there was no love lost between them and their rivals. War crimes were, no concept of that yet.
Didn't it say David was pleased that was the bride price? He's like, silver,
Yep.
gold can't do.
I can get Philistines.
Things, I can get that.
Yes. So Saul's jealousy arises again. He tries to kill him with a spear a second time. David flees out into the wilderness and is no longer in Saul's service, and he ends up attracting to himself a band of misfits and outcasts. There's 600 of them, and include some of his cousins, the sons of Zuriah, who is David's sister.
Ooh.
They would actually be his nephews, not his cousins. They join him, and a whole bunch of other people. Unruly band of outlaws, essentially, is what he's got.
That's chaotic.
Yep. Now, in the process of fleeing, David goes through the priestly town of Nob, tries to avoid incriminating the priests of Nob by telling them a false story so that David could go through there without them having to choose whether we're going to help David in defiance of the king or help Saul by arresting David and turning him over.
So he decided to
Cooks up a pretense
right.
and asks for bread and asks for a sword, and this is where he gets the sword of Goliath because it was kept in Nob at that point in time, and so he's got the sword of Goliath on his back now. And unfortunately, Saul then comes chasing after him, finds out the priests of Nob helped him, and he puts to 70 of them to death, one of whom was a descendant of Eli. And Samuel spoke that none of his sons or descendants would ever live to see old age. And it happened in that generation too. So So Saul continues pursuing David. David attacks the Philistines at Keilah and wins a battle there. Saul hears about it and goes pursuing after him. In the wilderness, David twice gets opportunities to kill Saul. One time was in a cave. Saul had to relieve himself, and he went into a cave for some reason instead of just digging a hole outside. But in any case, David and his men were hiding in the back of the cave, and Saul doesn't even know anything of it. Another time, it was in the middle of the night. Saul and Abishai, one of the sons of Zeruiah, sneak into the camp. And Abishai,
David and Abishai?
yep, David and Abishai, thank you, sneak into the camp of Saul. And they get right into Saul's tent. And Abishai wants to strike Saul dead. And David says, no, do not strike the Lord's anointed. David knows that he's the one Lord's anointed coming on next. And if you condone assassination, you will be assassinated too. So he has a strict no assassination policy. Goes well for David. So he just steals the water jug from next to Saul's head and runs off, calls out to Abner, has a conversation with Abner in the hearing range of the entire army of Israel. Abner, why didn't you protect your lord the king, or my lord the king? I came and stole a water jug from his tent and a spear, and we could have killed him, but we didn't. And Saul is horrified to realize how close he was to an assassin's hand who spared him. So Saul stops pursuing David at this point, but David doesn't trust Saul, little wonder, and flees down to the Philistines.
Wait, so David just walked into his camp just for the heck of it?
I think he had an idea of, I'm going to demonstrate my loyalty to Saul, so he stops pursuing me.
Okay. And it worked.
And it worked. But he didn't trust him, and so David fled and went down to the land of the Philistines. And he's down there for a year and 4 months.
The Philistines just let David live with them?
There was a lot of tension. They knew that he was an outcast from Saul's camp, but they do know that this is the one that they sing, Saul has killed his thousands and David has killed his 10,000s, referring to Philistines in particular. So, yeah, one of the Philistine kings takes him in, lets him live in Ziklag, and David carries on this double life. So he's telling the Philistines, I went raiding in Judah, and really he was raiding the enemies of Israel, and he would raid the Geshurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites. The Amalekites are of course supposed to be dead, but they're not.
So you really laid it on heavy duty.
Yep. He never left a survivor so that anybody could actually report to the Philistines what happened. And he would show up in the land of the Philistines and be like, here's all the spoil left from raiding the Israelites. And actually what he was doing is raiding the enemies of the Israelites, giving a chunk of the spoil to the Israelites in Judah, especially his clansmen and kinsmen, gaining their favor and showing them, look what I'm doing to your enemies, and then making this false pretense to the Philistines. And it works wonderfully for a year and 4 months, and then all of a sudden he is stuck in a really sticky wicket. Because Saul is going to war against the Philistines, and the Philistines are collecting all their soldiers to muster a very large army, and David and his men march out, and they're about to be sent into battle against their brothers, the Israelites, and the Philistine lords are like, to heck with this plan. How better would David be able to ingratiate himself to Saul and get back in his good graces and cut us down from behind the lines?
So he presumably has a little more than 600 men by this point then?
No, he only has 600 men.
Oh.
But if you're in the rear guard and nobody's watching for you, you can just cut people down left and right because they don't have any armor on their backs and they're not expecting you or any death to be coming from behind them.
Yeah, I suppose.
So
Confusion and chaos.
he gets sent back to Ziklag. They return to their village and discover that somebody has come and raided the Ziklag, and so then they have to go off and recover all of their wives and children and all their possessions, and they're able to do that. In the meantime, Saul is trying to find out the word of the Lord for how to fight this battle. He can't get the word of the Lord from the priest because it's not working, and so he goes and consults the witch of Endor to brings Samuel back from the dead. This is one of the craziest stories in the entire Old Testament, because Saul, who's alive, is having a conversation with Samuel, who is dead.
Through the Witch of Endor.
Through the Witch of Endor, who is not supposed to legally be living in the land of Israel. Anyway, Samuel says, tomorrow you and your sons are going to be with me in death. And it happens as was spoken by the prophet. Saul dies. 3 of his sons also die in battle, including Jonathan. Benadab and Malchishua are the other 2.
Jonathan died?
Yes, Jonathan dies in that battle. And it's sad, but it makes for a very clean transition, because he would have been the crown prince, but Jonathan knew David is supposed to become king. So much in the same way that John the Baptist was moved out of the way so that Jesus could become preeminent, Jonathan is moved out of the way so that David can become preeminent. And it happens just that way. However, there's a 4th son by the name of Ishbosheth, and Abner survives the battle against the Philistines. He puts Ishbosheth on the throne of Israel. And then there's war for 5 years between Judah, who makes David king in Hebron, and Ishbosheth, who was reigning north of there. And Ishbosheth eventually gets assassinated by his own men because he is on the losing side of this civil war. And eventually Abner actually intends to come over to David's side. He's killed by Joab so that he can't actually do what he was intending to do. But eventually all Israel comes to David and makes him king. Now at this time he had been reigning in Hebron, and Hebron is like a chief city of the people of Judah. This is where Caleb had settled. This is where the giants were driven out from. And it's really risky for the king to be reigning in an individual tribe, because that's going to make that tribe preeminent amongst the 12, and that seems really dangerous politically, because then everybody can start complaining that David is partial to the people of Judah. So when he becomes king over all Israel, he decides to move the capital to a place where nobody has any claim, because the Israelites had not actually possessed it yet. Jerusalem was attacked and burned down by Joshua, but the Israelites didn't actually resettle in it, and the Jebusites moved into Jerusalem once again during the period of the Judges, and they were living there when David took the head of Goliath there. And after he's made king over all Israel, he goes and takes Jerusalem, and this actually completes the conquest that began under Joshua. And he reigns 33 years there in Jerusalem.
Oh, so it was a smart political move.
Smart political move, because now he's in a capital city that does not belong to Judah officially. It doesn't belong to Benjamin actually either, because it was right on the border between the 2 of them, but it was actually kind of a no man's land.
And he took it in such a banger way.
Yep, they snuck in through a water shaft. He didn't exterminate the entire population though, because at the end of his reign, he buys Temple Mount from Araunah, the Jebusite. And so he was able to take possession of the city, but it wasn't an extermination campaign. So then David goes on and fights wars all over the place. He finishes conquering the remaining part of the inheritance. And whereas Saul fought against the Philistines, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the kings of Zoah, and even the Arameans, Saul did not subdue them in the sense of making them a tributary state to Israel. So David actually subdued them and made them start paying tribute to him. And that was a major source of royal revenue for the king of Judah and Israel then. As the Philistines, the Edomites, and the Moabites were all sending a fair chunk in taxes and tribute every single year. And this, of course, took place over the course of his reign. He didn't get them all instantly at the beginning. There was a series of wars against the Philistines. When they heard he had been crowned king, they were concerned They went up to war against the people of Israel multiple times, and David defeated them every time using different stratagems. And he had run-ins with the Edomites, the Moabites, and the Ammonites, and so forth, all the way to the end of his reign. It was a reign that was characterized by lots of war. But he actually fought battles way up by the Euphrates River, really close to the homeland of Abram, where Terah and his descendants came from, and where Laban and his descendants continued to live. Of course, one of the major events of David's life that had consequences in the palace and all the court intrigues is his sin with Bathsheba. This takes place during one of the battles and campaigns against the Ammonites. As David stayed in Jerusalem, he had sent Joab out in charge of the army and stayed in Jerusalem himself, which is either neglecting your duties or delegating your duties out to somebody, depending on which way you want to look at the passage. Hear it preached both ways, depending on who's preaching. But Bathsheba is the wife of Uriah, who's a Hittite, actually. I'm not sure if that is a Canaanite Hittite or a different Hittite. But Nathan the prophet confronts him. David repents immediately instead of making excuses for himself like Saul did when he was confronted. However, he himself spoke forth the consequences of the sin in Nathan's parable. David responded to it, "May the person who did this pay for it 4 times over." And that is exactly what happened. First, the son that was born to Bathsheba died. Second, Amnon, who is the crown prince of David's household, gets killed by Absalom, who is the third-born son. Then Absalom, who is the third-born son, tries to make himself king, and he gets killed by Joab. And then later, at the very end of David's life, Adonijah is trying to set himself up as king. Doesn't work. He's the fourth-born. The second-born son has a quiet life of no consequence in the
He
scriptures.
was probably a musician.
He may have been a musician. He may have died young. He was Abigail's son, actually. Kileab, I think, was his name. Actually, this was after David has passed away, but Adonijah gets on Solomon's bad side and actually is executed by Solomon.
Doesn't he ask for one of David's concubines or something?
Yep, Abishag, tragic story. Now David intended to build a temple in Jerusalem once he had conquered all of his enemies and gathered together all kinds of plunder. And at the beginning of his reign, once he took Jerusalem, he sets up his tent there and starts construction of a palace. And he's like, I want the Ark of the Covenant here. The Ark of the Covenant had been neglected during all of Saul's reign, and David goes and gets it at the very beginning of his reign. And he brings it to Jerusalem, sets it up in a tent, which is interesting because we think of like the Israelites are building stone structures and stone buildings, but actually most everything in this point is still referencing tents. And so it wasn't as well developed as we think. Wanted to build a temple, God says no, and tells him that his son would build the temple for the Lord. So David is honored by this, though, because he realizes, wow, I'm actually going to start a dynasty, because Saul was not able to successfully get a dynasty launched, and God said, you are going to have a house or a dynasty. So David does everything except build the temple. He draws up the plans for the temple, and then he starts stockpiling materials so that it'll be easy for Solomon to do it as soon as he begins reigning. And he collects 3,750 tons of gold, 37,500 tons of silver, bronze and iron beyond measure. This is just after the Bronze Age, and they shifted into the Iron Age at this point, and so they have both metals in abundance, and that technology is for iron is around. He imports cedar logs from Lebanon, and he starts stockpiling stone for all the stonemasons. And then he actually gets the whole workforce figured out too. And this workforce is actually the Canaanite survivors and descendants of the Gibeonites that made the treaty with Joshua so they wouldn't be exterminated. The water carriers and woodcutters. And David gets them organized as stonecutters, masons, carpenters, woodcutters, and so forth.
You know what that works though, because then you don't have to like delegate it out to the Israelites, because the Israelites would complain and be like, oh, you're
Forced labor.
exactly.
Yep.
But the Canaanites,
They're still alive,
they're still alive. We're
Yep.
not exterminating you. You just do our labor.
but they are second-class citizens, and Saul ran into trouble by trying to exterminate them once, because he was so zealous, even though they were not supposed to be. But then David sees that once the temple is built, there's going to have to be an organizational system to maintain it and maintain the temple worship there. So he has 24,000 men set up to supervise working on the temple. 6,000 get set aside as officials and judges. 4,000 are gatekeepers, and he also arranges for 4,000 musicians. And several of those musicians get named. Heman, Asaph, and Ethan are 3 of those that are named. There's a few others, Jeduthun and Kenaniah and so forth. And organizing this relieves Solomon of the duty of trying to figure all that out and cook it up from scratch. But this is an interesting thing, because one of the things that David introduces into Hebrew worship and the whole religion of following God is the idea of worshiping him by music. Like, that was not a thing until David institutes it here at the end of his reign and structures it and organizes it, because he wanted the temple to always have musicians always playing instruments and praising God and singing the Psalms, of which David apparently wrote at least 73 of them. That's over almost half of them. And up to this point in the whole law of Moses, they weren't opposed to music. There was just nothing set aside, no provisions for that. David had this vision: we can sing and we can worship God through song, and we're going to have this organized so that it can be done on a continual basis. Which is one of the reasons why there are so many. It's not that they had 4,000 singing and playing music all at once. They would have rotations and such through the months of the year. People would take a few weeks on and a few weeks off and so forth. So this is one of David's major contributions to how we practice our faith, actually, that impacts us today. After 40 years of reigning in Jerusalem and Hebron, things start transitioning, and as I mentioned it earlier, his 4th-born son Adonijah tries to set himself up as king while David is approaching his deathbed. He's not dead yet, but he's very much up there in years and not fully coherent about what is actually going on. And so he is in his latter years of life and not reigning particularly strongly. Joab, the commander of the army, and Abiathar, one of the chief priests, decide to throw their support behind Adonijah. However, Nathan the prophet and Zadok the priest hear about what's going on, and they inform David and ask him, weren't you intending to put Solomon on the throne? And David confirms he was. And so he goes ahead and does it right then and there that very day, and puts Solomon on his throne and has him crowned as king, and he bows down to Solomon, and all of Jerusalem recognized who is now the king. And
So, Solomon became the king before David died.
yes, they have a few months of a co-regency. So Solomon is starting to establish himself as king, and David is making sure the succession takes place the way he wants it to, while he's still alive to supervise and has some influence over people. So Adonijah, Joab, and Abiathar all run off, and Joab is granted amnesty by David, but he tells Solomon, make sure his gray head goes down to the grave in blood, not peacefully. And Solomon is able to execute Joab shortly into his reign after David has died.
By Benaiah?
Yeah, by Benaniah, one of David's mighty men, who then replaces Joab as commander of the army. Abiathar doesn't get executed because he carried the ephod with David in the wilderness way back in the caves of En-Gedi and the cave of Adullam
Oh,
So-
with, Absalom?
Yep, so Abiathar, not with Absalom,
Oh,
no, with, when David was fleeing from Saul.
oh, they took you fought with them?
Yep, Abiathar was one of the relatives at Nob, and when all of his relatives of the priests were killed by Saul, he grabbed the linen ephod and ran off into the wilderness after David.
That's that guy?
That's that guy.
Oh.
He was the last priest of the line of Ithamar, though, and Zadok the priest and his descendants then become the high priestly family and clan under Solomon.
So then we're on the third one then? Are we on the third high priestly family then? Cause it was.
Yep, it was Aaron's line through Eleazar and Phinehas. We lose track of them somewhere between Phinehas and the days of Eli. It shifted from descendants of Eleazar to the descendants of Ithamar, who was Eleazar's brother. Eli and his descendants are the line of Ithamar. Abiathar is the last of them to wear the linen ephod and be the high priest. And he was kind of like a co-high priest because Zadok and Abiathar were both high priests under David's reign for some reason. And then he's replaced by Zadok when Solomon takes the throne. But yeah, they actually have an official brief co-regency while David is approaching his deathbed. Solomon gets placed on the throne even though David is yet alive, and that is the way you ensure the right person becomes king. Similar thing is happening in Saudi Arabia today, actually. The king is in his late 80s and on all kinds of life support systems, but they have gone through a few crown princes, and the current one who is running Saudi Arabia is known as MBS for short. Is it Mohammed bin Salman? Something like that.
Sounds vague, right?
Anyway, yeah, he's the one who actually is wielding authority in Saudi Arabia today, even though it officially his uncle or some relative is actually on the throne. He is the one who's actually calling all the shots, and the world leader that other people, or the people that all their world leaders talk to. The co-regency is going to be a little longer. It'll be measured in years instead of months. Anyhow, David dies shortly after that with Solomon on the throne. And next week we'll see what happens in the reign of Solomon.
I suppose the other benefit though is that it allows David to communicate a lot of things to Solomon about running the place, like.
Presumably he'd been doing that for a few years, and there's some hints at that in the end of First Chronicles that David was communicating instructions to Solomon. So, do you have any questions, Ariana?
Yeah, where in the line was Solomon? Like,
He was the first surviving son of Bathsheba, but he would have been son 8, 9, 10, 12, somewhere way down the line.
but he was by Bathsheba.
Yep. Yep, he was the eldest son, surviving son of Bathsheba, which is an interesting point of redemption and restoration in
Mhm.
that story.
Another example of God using.
Yep.
sin and heal for good.
All right, we'll wrap up there.